Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for being here for this afternoon session. As you know, a key part of the focus over the last day or so has been on the fundamental issue of financial risk and some of the implications in terms of our economy and what needs to be done about it. But there's many people who would say that this is just one manifestation of a whole set of other interrelated risks. And just to show how risk even applies here in Davos, when we have 5 out of our 6 speakers, our 6th speaker right now is caught in traffic risk, which is what happens when you overload a system. And so Herman Gref will be joining us in just a few minutes. But it shows that risk is everywhere. And when we look back even over the last 12 months, huge volatility in the stock markets, huge volatility in the financial markets, but also huge volatility in the commodity markets. And the implications of the food crisis of a year ago, we forget that led to outbreaks and riots in over 30 countries, and actually led to the fall of a government, at least one government in Haiti, and significant strain on other countries in the developing world. If we look at the impact of the fuel volatility in terms of planning as well as costs over the last year as well, we see that there's been increased volatility across a number of different areas. In fact, we produce a little report every year, which was a bit of a sleepy seller in the past, but has become, strangely enough, a bestseller this year, the Global Risks 2009 report. And in it, in fact, the teams identified over 24 risks in terms of different areas, from food to pandemic to fuel. The challenge is, as Klaus Schwab mentioned in the opening speech, is if we try to deal with this sequentially, we could essentially lurch from crisis to crisis as one risk area and then another risk area put our global systems out of control. So the bad news is it's probably impossible to try to deal with these interrelated issues sequentially. The good news is there may be lessons learned from the challenges of the financial crisis and some of these other systemic risks we've been dealing with that can actually help inform decision-making in the private and public sector in these other areas as well. So we have with us a great panel to discuss these issues. And let me start with Gary Cohn, who is the President and Chief Operating Officer of Goldman Sachs. And Gary, obviously you've been thinking a lot about the issue of risk and its implications. And maybe to start off with a general question, what do you see as the lessons from what's occurred in the financial industry over the last year, both for that industry but maybe more broadly in terms of interrelated complex systems?
Okay. Let me thank you very much for having me here today. Let me first start out and talk about risks in the financial services, and then I'll translate in my 3 minutes into another risk or two. Look, risk management is not a science. It's an art form. It's not a perfect art form, and we all have to understand that. The vast majority of risk models and risk decisions are all made on historical data. Historical data is only as good as history, and as we all know, history does repeat itself, but history reinvents itself every time. So anyone who got caught, and that includes everyone who was managing risk based on historical data, obviously had a problem. Markets are supposed to be diversified. Markets are not supposed to all correlate. Not all asset classes are supposed to trade in the same way. We have gone through a year now where we've seen much greater correlation across every asset class and across different regions than we have ever in the past. Number two, in risk management, we make a basic assumption that you can hedge risk and you can continually hedge risk, and markets will operate in a somewhat liquid and transparent fashion. I think we learned early in this crisis that markets may not operate in a liquid and transparent fashion, and in fact, we may have to improvise on the ability to hedge risk and deal with very volatile and very dislocated markets. Number three, I think, lesson we learned is if you don't see it, and it's not on your balance sheet, you may not be managing it, but in a tough environment, you may actually own the risk. One of the biggest lessons I think that will come out of this is everyone needs to understand all of their ancillary risks, not the risk that they see every day when they walk in, but all of the peripheral risks that lie around the edges of their business and things where they may not see as risk, but in a tough environment, they're going to clearly have a risk to that. Number four, quickly, size matters. You know, when you're small in a position or you're small in a risk, you can tend to manage it, and you tend to make very quick decisions. When you're very large and you have an asymmetrically skewed risk, you tend to contemplate your decisions much longer, and what tends to happen is the risk tends to get worse over time. The last two things I'm going to touch on quickly are really somewhat related, and they're in how you would literally look at your risk on a day-by-day basis. I strongly believe in the mark-to-market world. When you mark a position to market every day, you are taking a measure of its value, and you are making a conscientious decision to buy or sell, to own or not to sell something. And you're getting a very clear view on other people's value of an asset that you own or you don't own. When you're not in a mark-to-market world, and when you're in a basic hold-to-maturity world, once a month, once a quarter, whatever your accounting period tends to be, you take an evaluation at the asset, and you may be very well surprised how dramatically something has moved, and at that point, it may be too late to look at it. Last point I will make is many people have gotten very comfortable at outsourcing risk management. The biggest outsourcer of risk management are the credit rating agencies. Many people look at credit ratings as a way to manage risk. When they buy a AAA security, they think it means something. When they buy a single A security, they think it means something. Unfortunately, I think credit rating agencies are mostly backward looking. They tend to react to a situation after it's happened, very similar to the hold to maturity non-mark-to-market world. An interesting little anecdote that was shocking to me when I actually found this out. When you look at credit ratings, at the beginning of 2008, there were 12 AAA companies in the world. There were 64,000 AAA-rated securities in the world that had been created in the financial markets, which is an interesting risk in itself. Turning to forward-looking and moving on, I think the one issue that's still out there lurking that we saw rear its ugly head in 2008, but because of economic situations did not persist long enough for people to do something about it, is commodity price risk, and specifically oil price risk, although all commodities are involved. We have, as a global economy, have completely underinvested in the commodity infrastructure of the world. When we get global growth back again, we will see extremely high oil prices, which will be a direct reflection on not having invested in oil infrastructure for the last years. In fact, over the last 2 decades, we have taken oil storage down from 20 days of global consumption to 10 days of global consumption. And there's many statistics like that that will tell you that the margin of error in global commodities is just not what it needs to be to sustain a robust global economy.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. And in fact, this issue of commodities, if you ask Lisette Sheeran of the World Food Program, I know that she noted that at some points world food stocks are at less than 60 days of global consumption. Key issue in terms of risk isn't something you can mathematically model away. At the end of the day, it requires judgment, it requires constant oversight, and really, in a sense, that means it requires good governance. And John Drzik, I got that right, President and Chief Executive Officer of Oliver Wyman, has been very involved in the whole issue of the management, oversight, and governance of risks. John, how do you see how governance should play a role from both the private and public sector response on this?
Sure. Let me make a few comments first on organizational governance issues, and then I'll make a couple of comments on some related topics. In terms of organizational governance, one of the things I think that we've seen is that risk cannot be a compliance function in organizations. It needs to be a function that can significantly influence the strategy and business decisions of organizations. And so it needs to be positioned in the right place in organizations to do that. And the information that comes from the risk function, there needs to be a cultural willingness to act on that information in the best interest of the organization. So I think the placement of the risk function, and this goes beyond financial services, it would also be true for risk analysis in the public sector and the risk management function in non-financial corporates. I think this would be equally true. Secondly, I'd say that it's important for the executive leadership of organizations to ask the right questions of the risk function. This builds a little bit on a point that Gary made, but that they need to ask, what are the risks that can bring down the organization across the various businesses that the company might participate in, rather than ask questions which can bring answers which are based on statistical analysis related to only one part of the organization and don't really identify the black swan risks, if you will, that can bring down the whole of the organization. Finally, I'd comment that it's important organizationally for firms to, and this is equally true also thinking about the public sector, to set risk tolerance and risk appetite limits and have an active dialogue on what that risk tolerance is, and that if it's breached, to again have the cultural willingness to act on it. So I think there's a number of things within the organizations that can be changed in terms of where risk is positioned and how risk is modeled relating to the overall topic of risk governance. I would raise two additional points that are related. First, I think throughout this crisis, I think one of the things that's been highlighted is that our time horizon of our thinking has been too short. Gary made the point around models that are backward-looking and statistical can give you the wrong answer, and you need to build in a layer of judgment that reflects a wider and longer institutional memory around risk. Just shifting to another risk sphere, if we don't see a hurricane hit Florida for the next 5 years, it doesn't mean that that risk is any less than it is today. And you can go into pandemics or other topics in risk. Gary referenced oil prices. These are things that the volatility might be low for a while, but it might just be deceiving. And we need longer institutional memory in the organizations we build in both the public and private sector in order to try to avoid this potential trap. Finally, I would highlight in the financial crisis, one of the things that's become clear is that the mitigation of the risk once it becomes present requires a concerted and coordinated approach, in this case across the public and private sector and across national boundaries, and that this is a topic that when you get into how do you revise regulation in order to try to address this, it comes into conflict. You have national interests, and then you have these supranational interests at stake. And extrapolating again from the financial sector to other risk spheres, imagine this in the context of food security or water security or vaccine allocation in the face of a pandemic. These are going to be issues that are going to, again, bring national politics in conflict with international coordination in terms of the best possible risk mitigation response. So I think there's a number of things that the financial crisis has thrown a spotlight on that we can learn from, not only to prevent the next financial crisis, but also extrapolate to a wider sphere of risk, and we should do that.
Well, thank you very much, John. And the whole issue of systemic risks really requiring a systemic response is absolutely critical. And if Gary was saying that size matters, in terms of the response, what location matters, in terms of where in the organization people are taking real responsibility for the judgment calls being made around this. The other element which I thought was pretty powerful is the whole issue of organizational risk. You can have a specific financial risk, but what are the risks that cumulatively or in interrelated fashion could take down your organization and actually take out its right to play for the future? And in a sense, that's true for corporations. That's also true for nations in terms of the impact on the entire organization. I'm very pleased to have with us Herman Gref, who's the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Sberbank, but also has played an absolutely critical role in the past years as a very senior minister in the Russian government. And Mr. Gref, I wonder if you could share your perspectives, both on what you see as some of the major risks out there, but in particular, what do you see as the implications of the financial and economic risks for country risk and the implications for policymakers?
Thank you very much. It's very good opportunities for me to speak in so big auditorium. And my English is not so good for the teen teams, and if it is possible, I speak Russian. Я согласен с тем, что говорил Джон, но, на мой взгляд, есть разный уровень рисков. И риски обсуждать надо в последовательности их опасности. Главные риски, которые мы имеем сегодня, это риски макроэкономические. И буду говорить, наверное, больше как бывший чиновник, как бывший член правительства, нежели сегодня бизнесмен. Я считаю, что все, что мы сегодня имеем в мире, все реализованные риски, это заложенные ошибки в макроэкономическом регулировании и недостатки, которые долгое время, противоречия, которые долгое время накапливались. Одно из главных противоречий – это противоречие между глобальной ролью некоторых государств и глобальной ролью некоторых институтов и их частными интересами. Это ключевая проблема. Соединенные Штаты Америки. Очевидно, что создание в виде ФРС органа, который отвечает за, фактически является мировым эмиссионным центром. Он подчиняется правительству Соединенных Штатов Америки и решает в первую очередь проблемы своей страны. Институт был создан, но он не был отрегулирован. И сейчас как средство решения этой проблемы пытаются предлагать альтернативные резервные валюты в мире. На мой взгляд, это путь в никуда. Это не решает проблему. Во всяком случае, никто не предложил рациональный путь создания нескольких валют. И на это уйдут долгие годы. А проблема стоит сегодня. Уверен в том, что нет другого пути, кроме как регулирования деятельности Федеральной резервной системы, как мирового эмиссионного центра, в течение ближайшего года. Создание правил регулирования. Непозволительно использовать мировой эмиссионный центр для решения своих национальных экономических проблем. Фактически та кредитная накачка, которая произошла несколько раз в истории Соединенных Штатов Америки, в начале 2000-х годов имела очень масштабный характер, который привела к этому кризису, она сейчас имеет очень большую возможность к рецидиву, к повторению. И это самый большой риск, который мы сегодня имеем. Он реализуется в огромном объеме дефицита бюджета США. Это косвенный признак объема эмиссии. Это не сопровождается высокой инфляцией. В условиях кризиса и отсутствия ликвидных активов большой спрос на доллар. Поэтому доллар, несмотря на такую макроэкономическую политику, продолжает укрепляться. Но нужно понимать, что это решение проблемы одной страны и ошибок, макроэкономических ошибок одного правительства за счет огромного количества доноров. Недопустимо решение сейчас проблемы американской экономики старыми методами. Поэтому нужно срочно создавать правила регулирования работы мирового эмиссионного центра. И это первое глобальное противоречие, которое должно быть решено. Если оно решено быть, а если оно не будет решено, то оно имеет огромный риск рецидива с повторением кризиса через очень короткий период времени и значительно более глубокого, с масштабнейшими последствиями. Второй риск или вторая проблема – это глобальные финансовые институты, которые вошли очень глубоко в экономики целых стран и стали решать свои частные проблемы, в первую очередь в странах пребывания, и очень быстро стали вынимать капитал из стран, которые являются, рынки которых, по их мнению, являются второстепенными, что привело к обвалу рынков в целом ряде стран. Мы видим это на примере Восточной Европы. Несколько глобальных институтов вывели капитал, и рынки этих стран просто сложились, и все это привело к коллапсу, к экономическому коллапсу. Это тоже вторая проблема. Должен быть найден консенсуальный подход к тому, как фондировать глобальные финансовые институты с тем, чтобы они могли поддерживать глобальную финансовую стабильность. И это, наверное, не должно быть проблемой правительства отдельной страны. Если институт глобальный, взаимоотношения с ним должны быть отрегулированы у глобального эмиссионного центра. И, наверное, третья проблема – это проблема неотрегулированности и, соответственно, возникающий огромный риск поддержания ликвидности стран, которые пользуются резервной валютой. Спонтанно это было сделано в прошлом году. Мы видели, что ФРС предоставила несколько траншей странам в виде кредитных ресурсов, но это должна быть работающая система, которая сможет поддерживать ликвидность стран, которые оказались во временной затруднительной ситуации в силу сложившихся макроэкономических перекосов. От этого не должны страдать миллионы людей, и это не должно быть следствием поведения одного или нескольких финансовых институтов. Я бы сказал, что это три ключевые риска, от решения которых, от способа решения которых зависит глубина и продолжительность кризиса и рецидив подобного рода кризиса. Теперь, что касается рейтинговых агентств, банков и так далее, и так далее. Моя точка зрения, что и банки, и рейтинговые агентства в это втолкнули власти. В первую очередь ответственность за создание кризиса несут чиновники. Чиновники создали все условия для того, чтобы банки, финансовые институты, фонды работали по тем правилам, по которым они работали. Если какой-то финансовый институт оказывался в тисках своего очень хорошо выстроенного риск-менеджмента, то он проиграл в конкуренции. Он тут же, его котировки падали, он перестал быть интересным для инвесторов, прибыль его падала, и мы построили очень такой виртуальный мир, виртуальной конкуренции, и не играть по этим правилам означало потерять все. Ты не успешен как институт, ты не успешен как менеджер, и поэтому все играли по этим правилам. Если мы имеем провал риск-менеджмента в огромном количестве корпораций, значит, это не проблема корпораций, это проблема регулятора. И нужно понимать, что эту проблему регуляторы понимали, тем не менее, это был способ решения преодоления возникающих микрокризисов в предыдущие годы. И ни для кого это не было секретом. Но эти правила игры были созданы, поэтому все компании по этим правилам игры работали. Поэтому я считаю, что сейчас заниматься нужно этой проблемой, конечно же, комплексно, но первичными проблемами являются те проблемы, которые я сказал. Это проблемы глобальной макроэкономических перекосов. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. And really the view that systemic crises require systemic responses, and the challenge when you have national institutions with global roles, or if you have regulatory frames that private sectors are working within that actually distorts the ability to focus on perhaps more rigorous risk management issues. And another key element of the interface between national behaviors and global implications, of course, is in the whole area of trade and commerce and the possibility of protectionism as a potential response. Certainly, if we look at history. I'm very pleased we have with us Kamal Nath, the Minister of Commerce and Industry of India. And how do you, sir, see the present situation in terms of this next wave of systemic risk, in terms of national trade responses actually perhaps exacerbating some of the economic challenges we have?
Well, we are hearing sounds of protectionism, and that's the first response. We must recognize where we are. In the last 10 years, there has been globalization as never before. Even a country like India, our engagement with the global economy is $500 billion in goods and services. Now, at the heart of globalization lies global competitiveness. When any country runs into a crisis, they're losing jobs. The first thing is that let's be protectionist. I believe that this response is an initial response, but a wholly incorrect response, because protectionism is going to lead to erosion of competitiveness. And we've seen this happen. We've seen this happen many times. We've seen protectionist measures, even which are WTO compliant. We do have a WTO, a rule-based multilateral system now. Even within the rule-based multilateral system, there has been protectionist measures by non-tariff barriers. We had this in India, where countries said, okay, you can, there's no problem, there's no barrier, but packing. The packing standards put were, it's got to be packed in a crate, a wooden crate, and the crate must be sprayed by an insecticide. Well, we could never find the insecticide, and we could never find the insect. So here was a barrier that meant you couldn't pack it. So looking for some pest and pesticide was a huge problem. Now, you can have protectionist measures which are in the guise of WTO compliance. And I think that when we see the last 2 months, 3 months, and we are looking at jobs, I tried to figure out if how many of these jobs could be saved by protectionist measures. And I found there was none. Now, if somebody says we're going to have a protectionist measure and we're not going to allow auto components to be imported, well, it won't end there. They'll have to even stop cars from being imported. What happens to the consumer? So global competitiveness is going to remain at the heart of globalization, of trade. And this first response to this global crisis of being protectionist, I think will be recognized. Why does somebody outsource? They outsource because they want to be globally competitive. They don't have the skills, or the service is better provided at cheap, much more economically provided somewhere else. The moment that outsourcing stops, what happens to costing? So if you're not going to have auto components, you're not going to be able to produce a vehicle, automobile to sell. You're not going to have, if you're not going to outsource, maybe you can't do some of the research and development. The costs of producing those goods will increase. So I see that this is just a panic response of protectionism. There is some element of protectionism which, at least from India, we are seeing in Europe in terms of some non-tariff barriers which are coming. But in the long term, I think the most important risk which we need to look at when we talk of protectionism is how do we maintain and sustain healthy economies in developing countries. It's very important for the health of the developed countries to have healthy economies in developing countries. And developing countries, in India alone, we provide a market for 300, 400 million people of the middle class who are moving from, if you look at the bottom end of the pyramid, moving from having 1 meal a day to 2 meals a day, from two legs to 2 wheels to 4 wheels. And these are the markets, whether it's India or Asia or Africa. So when we talk of managing this crisis, we talk of risk. One of the risks, along with protectionism, or what protectionism would lead to, would be hurting healthy economies of developing countries, which I think are most important to the health of developed countries.
Well, thank you very much, sir. And an important fact that underlines that is 2009 will be the first time when 100% of net global growth will in fact be coming from developing countries. And so when looking at the importance of developing countries as future engines of growth, it's perhaps more important now than ever. Well, we're talking about a period of great interrelated systemic risk. Of course, there was a period back 50, 60 years ago when there was a combination of economic risk, political risk, leading to conflict, and out of that, a whole set of global institutions designed to deal with the exigencies of the time. The challenge now is, are these institutions able to reinvent themselves and realign themselves in order to deal with the challenges of today? And so I'm very pleased that we have John Lipsky, who's first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, with us today. And sir, please, I invite you, if there's any specific comments you've heard up until now you would like to respond to, and more generally, what do you see the challenge of a 20th century institution dealing with these 21st century systemic risk issues?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. We've heard some very interesting comments so far, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss them further. But when thinking about the institutions, the basic institutions of the global order, if you will, you want to start by asking whether, in broad terms, the past 50, 60 years have been ones of success or failure. And I would say, in broad terms, they've been one of great success. That the idea of creating open markets and on a fair rules-based system that's reliable and stable is produced great results. In fact, the period 2002-3 to 2006 was one of exceptionally good global economic performance that has come upon some very significant challenges. We have to make sure that we can put a stop to the deterioration in economic performance and reestablishes the base for continued progress. How are we doing that at the IMF? Very briefly, we have a very multifaceted approach. One, we've recognized that the changes in the global order have required changes in the institutions. We haven't felt that it required wholesale changes, inventing new institutions, but making the existing ones work better in the current context. That's involved for the IMF. Governance reform, where we're working to change the balance of power and quotas in the institution to better reflect the actual world order. We've looked to change the facilities that we offer our members to try to make them more responsive to the actual needs. We've restructured internally and sought new skills that have clearly been necessary, especially understanding the nexus between financial and macroeconomic performance. We've understood that we need to do a better job of multilateral analysis, of regional analysis, as well as of individual country economies. And we've recognized that we need to seek new partnerships internationally with other institutions and with other decision makers. It seems to me that we're headed in a good direction, but the challenges are very substantial. To my mind, for example, the recent Group of 20 Leaders Summit was an important symbol of the recognition, broad recognition, that there has to be improvements in global governance. There is an action plan that is both concrete and complete. It will be very difficult to achieve success, and there are going to be a lot of discussions about what the right governance structure is going forward. But I'm confident that we have the tools to both understand what went wrong, to understand what needs preserving, and to make the decisions in a collective way that will restore the kind of prosperity that we had enjoyed in just recent previous years. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And while we're dealing with the financial situation, of course, some of the other very fundamental risks that are out there are environmental, ecological. In fact, while the economy is cooling down, the world is heating up. And what we simply want to do is reverse those two. Perhaps there's no one better positioned to actually provide us some perspective on both the challenges and dangers of missing the opportunity to deal with some of the climate change issues, but also perhaps some of the potential of taking advantage of the interrelatedness of some of our global risks. Nicholas Stern, who's former chief economist of the World Bank and now I.G. Patel, professor of economics and government at the London School of Economics. Mr. Stern.
Thank you. Let me take the advantage of going last by picking up the question of the interrelationship between these risks. And let me give a couple of examples. There are so many, but let me just give two. The two biggest challenges of the 21st century are managing climate change and the fight against world poverty. We succeed or fail on those two together. If we don't manage climate change, we create a physical environment that's so hostile that development is undermined. Unless we find a way of combining our measures on climate change with the promotion of economic development, we will not get, and we will not deserve to get, the crucial world coalition that we need. We have to find low carbon growth. We have to make it possible if we're to manage climate change. Those two are very closely interlinked. The current economic crisis brings real dangers of protectionism, not simply through tariffs, but also through, and here Minister Nath was very clear, through other kinds of ways. The promotion and the defence of domestic financial systems, absolutely crucial, risks putting a barrier on trade finance. It falls through the cracks, and the relative price of trade finance relative to other forms of finance goes up. That's implicit protectionism, an example of the linking between economic crisis and trade. And of course, strong protectionism makes the whole world economy much more risky. A closed economy is more risky, broadly, than an open economy, notwithstanding the risks of transmission there are in open economies. You could go on to the links between climate change, poverty and health. But wherever you look, and just thinking about global risks now, there's a profound linkage. And what do we, or should we draw from the fact that we've got several global risks to manage linked together? Well, the first is that these have to be handled at the prime ministerial and presidential level, because they're all linked together. Important though trade ministers are, and they're very important, Minister Nath is particularly important. Important though environment ministers are, and they are very important. Important though finance ministers are. They are not empowered to deal with the interrelationships between these risks, and prime ministers and presidents have to handle them. And that's why I agree so strongly with John Lipsky. It was important that the G20 meeting moved from the finance minister level up to the prime minister and presidential level. It's a good group, far better than the G8, and if we can start to use it more effectively, then we would at least begin to get that prime minister presidential involvement. We have to have an approach which is built on listening and understanding. When I'm in the United States, I spend quite a lot of time describing what China is doing to combat climate change. When I'm in China, I spend quite a lot of time describing what the United States has been doing on technology and so on, notwithstanding the failure to ratify Kyoto. It's listening and understanding will be very important, the whole approach that we bring. The policies will be very important. How we design policies, I could develop the notion of carbon trading, but it's the kind of policy that binds people together, reducing costs in some countries, giving financial flows to others to help them to move to low carbon growth. So policies are important too, and they should be designed to bring people together. And institutions, we're going to need institutions. I think the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization are good examples of institutions that allow a place for people to come together under at least some shared assumptions. So we need the institutions as well. Now, finally, on climate change, and this isn't the moment to go into a full set of policies on climate change, we do need a strong agreement in Copenhagen of overall 50% cuts for the world, at least 80% cuts for rich countries, given their history and given their resources. We have to find our way to low carbon growth, and it's through that kind of sets of policies and those kinds of institutional arrangements which will involve targets, which will involve carbon trading, which will involve sharing of technology, which will involve finance for the fact that development in a more hostile climate, adaptation if you like, is going to be more difficult. This will be a very powerful example this year of how we put those things together, those policies, approaches, targets, to deal with what is, after all, the biggest problem of all. Because if Miami or Calcutta or St. Petersburg or Holland, countries, wherever you look, if they go underwater, people can move. It's not pretty, it's tragic, but what we're gambling is not one region or one city, we're gambling the whole thing. And the science is very clear on this. So in dealing with the biggest risk of all, I think we can build an understanding and a way of working together which will help us deal in a constructive way with all the other risks of trade and economic instability and pandemics and nuclear proliferation and so on.
Well, thank you very much. Well, in about 35 minutes, that was quite a tour d'horizon. If we look at all the different risks, the financial risk, macroeconomic risks, challenges of pandemic and health, challenges of the environment, as specific risks, but actually some of the system risks that actually systems design actually may be mismatched with their mission today. And out of that, organizational risks, where actually one or more of these interrelated risks could take out the organization, whether it's a corporation or a national ability to respond, and leave it vulnerable to further sets of risks. On the other hand, I jotted down at least 9 elements of response, which seem to have lessons that are applicable more broadly. I think Gary said it well with the first, it's an art. We can't wait for more massive model. It isn't supercomputers that are going to solve the issue of interrelated global risks. In fact, it's understanding it's an art, understanding that it requires judgment and real leadership is the second element of it. And that another key element of that, as I did as the third element, was that location matters in terms of leadership. That leadership on overall systemic risk has to involve the CEO or the president or the leadership of the country. And the fourth element I had is that also requires a historical perspective and a forward-looking perspective. The last thing you could do is have a present view on risks. You need to look back, need to look way back to understand some of the underlying elements of risk, but you also need to be prepared to look forward and understand that the risks today and in the recent past may not at all reflect the implications going forward. The fifth element, which is leaders have to look at the world as it is, not as they wish it was or that it had been, and that's actually what mark-to-market's all about. The sixth element is that size matters. Size matters in terms of resilience of a system and whether there's actually the size of an individual organization or a networked organization where organizations are actually mutually supporting one another. The ability of a system to absorb shock depends in part on the size of that system. And the other element on the seventh I had was system design. And a lot of the system design in terms of not only internal systems but policy and regulatory frameworks. And are the policies and regulatory frameworks designed in order to enhance and support good behavior, or do they actually lead to perverse incentives that actually undermine the ability of corporations or countries to actually do the right thing? And the eighth element, of course, is this is global. And therefore, attempts to come up with the right national solution are doomed systemically to fail, both in terms of short-term responses and broader system design. And then the ninth element is these are integrated. And shocks from one can affect the other in a negative way, but actually resolution of one of these items can actually resolve another. So actually resolution of some of the downward spiral of poverty and environmental degradation in developing country and some of the positive elements that have occurred there in the past actually may be having a positive economic effect going forward if we look at the positive potential role of the developing world in helping us move forward out of this recession. So I think a very comprehensive set of perspectives. We have about 15 minutes, and I'd like to get a chance for the audience to provide perspectives and questions. But Gary, you were first on this. I just wanted to see if Gary or John, if you had, after listening to the other speakers, some quick perspectives you wanted to provide.
I guess I'll throw this out there. It was interesting to listen to the protectionism. I think I was encouraged to hear it will be short term. I'm not sure I'm completely convinced about that because I think this whole idea of protectionism has sort of been taken out of the executive branches of governments and has been pushed down into the general population. When the general population sees their tax dollars being put to work to bail out industries, to bail out financial institutions, and then contemplates that bailed out institution competing against an entity from another country, I think we've now made this a much more localized issue than a national issue, and that is a concern to me. And I see that sort of as I travel the world. You know, is the United States going to allow other automobile manufacturers to compete against GM and Chrysler and Ford? And yes, they would like to. Are the taxpayers going to stand for that with billions of dollars of taxpayers' money in there? Are the UK financial institutions going to lend money to other corporations in other countries and withstand the loss? I don't know what the answers are, but it's definitely an interesting question.
Well, listen, let me open it to the floor. May I ask you to, if you are going to ask a question, please briefly identify yourself, and please a question or a brief comment of no more than 30 seconds, as we have about 12 minutes, and I'd like us to have a reasonable number of interventions. please put up your hand if you would like to engage. Please, the gentleman over here. Who is actually geographically furthest from both the mics. It's a system design flaw.
Jeff Riddell, Zurich Financial Services. One of the things that I work in the risk area, one of the things we see is that people perceive risk very differently from how they look at it. They see an asset risk very different from a liability risk, even though it may be the same. And it's really, Gary, I think, set it up with his point there. How important is it to deal with the perception of risk and also with the perception of the cause of risk and cause of problems, and to get to dealing with the real issues as opposed to being distracted by those perceptions?
Excellent question. Why don't we take 2 or 3 questions and comments like that, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to respond. Any other? Over here, please. The gentleman who's waving hand just like that. And then afterwards, the one who wasn't waving his hand like that before, but now is, because he realizes that's how I'm going to recognize.
Richard Muller. I work on the physics of national security at Berkeley. The comments about having to solve both climate change and poverty together are very, very, very strong and meaningful. India, China is building more than 1 new gigawatt coal burning plant every week. Expectations of the IPCC are that most of the global warming will come about from carbon emissions of the developing world. We can cut back in the wealthy countries, but and yet that energy production, many people believe, is linked to their growing economies. That makes the problem really tough. How do you get them to cut back and still have a growing economy?
Great question. Thank you. Why don't we take the other question or comment at the back, and then I'll ask the panelists to respond.
Thank you. Michael Stutchbury from the Australian newspaper. Reference has been made to the institutional breakthrough of the G20 leaders summit, and also to the reference has been made to the rising risk of protectionism. At the G20 leaders summit, I think in November, that instructed trade ministers to meet together by the end of 2008 to complete or get close to completion of the Doha round, and that doesn't seem to have happened. The question would be to Minister Nath and perhaps to Mr Lipsky and anyone else as to, is this the first failure of the G20 architecture?
Great. Well, perhaps on the question of the G20 and the trade element, and also this challenge of the interplay between development and climate change, carbon emissions, perhaps I could ask Minister Nath, and then perhaps if others would like to also.
Well, on the Doha round, the G20, the leaders did urge successful conclusion of the round. We must recognize that this round is dealing with some of the most contentious issues of global trade, which the Uruguay round didn't deal with. And for several years now, a lot of progress has been made. And as I've always said, that we are perhaps in the last lap. When you're in the last lap, you're really dealing with the most contentious of them all. There were efforts. But then I think the political space, what I felt, the political space available in December within the United States was not adequate for them to be able to move. There was a lot of technical work to be done. Having said that, the question is, will it happen? I've been asked this question last 24 hours many times, and I can only say this, that it will happen, and I think the imperatives of making it happen now are even more important. The rules of global trade, the rule-based multilateral trading system is extremely important for the world at this point of time. I go further and I say that we need the rules of the game of the financial system. We have the rules of the game of the trading system, but we really don't have any global rules of the game of the financial system. Anyway, that's a separate subject. But it can happen by respecting the sensitivities of countries. Now, here on one hand, we have countries in which India is included, where we say that I'm willing to negotiate commerce, but I'm not willing to negotiate livelihood security. My sensitivity is livelihood security and subsistence. Now, the sensitivities for the developed countries is commerce. These are two different kinds of sensitivities. Should the developing world allow market access for subsidized agricultural products? What do we tell Africa when the U.S. subsidies on cotton are 42 or 43%? And there are just few African countries that produce cotton, and that's a single crop. So this round has to come to a close by respecting the sensitivities of countries. And I see that there is a greater sensitivity, there's greater comprehension of each other's problems. And I am optimistic that during the next couple of months, with more intensive negotiations, we should be able to close this round, an imperative, before the end of this year.
Thank you very much. And Nick Stern, is it inevitable that we have to balance the risk of underdevelopment against the risk of climate change? Because it's true that the developing countries are now a significant portion of global growth. They are now a significant and growing portion of CO2 emissions. How do you deal with that seeming draconian trade-off that we may need to make?
I think it's a badly posed question, and there's not a draconian trade-off. High carbon growth will kill itself. In the short to medium term on oil prices, gas prices, and in the medium to longer term in terms of the disruption the damaged physical environment will cause.
They'll be self-limiting.
So high carbon growth is not a sustainable growth option other than over 10 or 15, maybe 20 years before these effects of high hydrocarbon prices and a little bit later than that, the environmental disruption. I mean, we risk seeing movements of people in terms of the 100 millions or billions as a result of destroyed habitats. Yeah. And we know that movement of people on that kind of scale leads to conflict, which would probably be extremely hard to manage. So we must be clear that high carbon growth is not a sustainable option. So it's either low carbon growth or no growth. And I think it's not a story of low growth, it's a story of low carbon growth. Actually, if it is a story of low growth, I think politically we won't get there and we're in deep trouble. So we have to recognize and foster low carbon growth. We know what zero carbon electricity looks like. We know we can do it. We're getting much better at it. And in the next 10 or 20 years, we'll get still better at it. Combination of all sorts of things. Solar, wind, nuclear, carbon capture and storage, and you can go on with another half dozen examples. They'll be competing with each other. Some of them will do better, some of them will do worse, but there's enough there for us to be pretty confident that we can do zero carbon electricity. If we can do zero carbon electricity, we can do zero carbon surface transport. So if you look, we can stop deforestation within a few years if we support the countries in where the trees stand in combining development which doesn't push so hard against the forest, new opportunities for those developing countries which they themselves describe, which will at the same time stop deforestation. And we can support the countries where the trees stand in that process. We can see how to do a very low carbon economy. We can see the technologies, we can see the policy instruments to do it. It's about political will. And it's about the management of the transition, because there'll be some dislocation as you move from one set of activities and ways of doing things to another. We have to manage that well. So this isn't about a choice. We don't have a choice. We have to find low carbon growth. And what the challenges are finding the political will to get together and the skill and the good sense to manage the dislocations, some of which will occur.
Well, excellent. In a sense, it comes back to the fundamental challenge raised by the gentleman from Zurich Financial, which is, can you recognize what the real risks are? And actually, can you recognize and price and therefore resolve them in a timely fashion?
We failed on systemic risk. At the country level, we failed on systemic risk, and at the global level, we failed on systemic risk. We, I think, need to find a way, a body, which is charged at a very responsible, distinguished level, which is charged with describing and calling and drawing attention to systemic risk. The closest we've got is the IMF. They do a good job, but I've worked for 10 years in international institutions. It's very hard to write a report in an international institution that's critical of a big country. We have to have a way of doing things which allows clear and early warning of systemic risk, not just on the economy actually, but we've got it, the WHO does that for health, but we have to find a way of doing that for the economy as a whole.
Interesting. So perhaps it's an excellent way to end up, which is this call for, in a sense, an institution with the right size and position and in true independence to be able to actually provide a perspective on these critical issues. Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel on this issue today.